Hey, hello everybody. It is wow, it's exactly 5:05. So, we are about to start our I'm gonna have to pause. Sorry, I was accidentally playing the recording in the background. So, welcome everybody. This is CLAGS's celebration of Trans Day of Visibility 2024, and we have some wonderful guests with us today. But before we start, I would like to first say that the event is live streamed on YouTube and it is recorded. Because it's a meeting and because it's not a webinar, if you are a guest and you turn on your camera and potentially turn on a sound, there is a possibility of you being broadcast live to everybody. So this is just a reminder that if you're concerned about having your face or your likelihood of shown, please make sure your camera is off during this event. Otherwise, we love to see everybody's faces and we will be spotlighting our speakers. But yeah, just a reminder that it is live streamed. And so if showing yourself is a concern, or if you're not in a place, or if you're not dressed in a way that you want to be seen, make sure your cameras are turned off. But I'm going to hand off the mic to our director, CLAGS's director, Matt Brim, who's going to give a few words about CLAGS.
Thank you, Yasmina. Hi, everybody. I am Matt Brim. I'm the Executive Director of CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies. We are housed at the CUNY Graduate Center. It's really our honor to have you here today to celebrate Transgender Day of Visibility. I'm going to say just a word about CLAGS, and then I'm going to ask for your support for the organization. CLAGS is the first university-based research center for the study of LGBT people and history and ideas and theories and praxis. We were founded in 1986 and we came to CUNY in 1991 at the Graduate Center. We believe that queer studies is for everybody, and we think queer studies should be free for everybody and accessible for everybody. So thanks to our ASL interpreters for being here today. Thanks to all of our participants for being here today. And thanks for you for being here today. If you want to support CLAGS at the end of today's program, you can do that by going to our website, which is clags.org, and you'll see that link in the chat. If you go to clags.org, you can click the donate button, which is right at the top, or you can just go to our Network for Good giving page, and that link will also be in the chat. We love all kinds of support, big and small. The best kind of support you can give us is just attending today, and you're already doing that, so we appreciate it so much. One other way you can support us is by reading some of the work of our Kessler winners. Every year, CLAGS has an annual sort of Lifetime Achievement Award for activism, art, or scholarship in LGBT studies. And we publish those Kessler lectures in 2 volumes. The first one is Queer Ideas, and that is the first decade of Kessler lectures, all the way back to 1992, when Joan Nestle gave the first Kessler talk. And then we have the second volume, Queer Then and Now, and that captures the 12 years of Kessler talks after that first decade. Those books are both published by the Feminist Press, which is also at the Graduate Center. And not only does it's a great cause, the Feminist Press, a great organization, but if you buy those books, a portion of the proceeds also come to CLAGS, and that's how you can support us, by buying the books. And by reading some of the best queer ideas that have been around since 1992. Thanks for being here so much. Yasmina, thank you for the time you've put into this today. I think that's it. Go to clags.org if you want to know more about the organization. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Matt. So I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about our panelists today and our guests, our dear guests. But before I do, here's our flyer for today's event. So I don't want to forget to say that this event was generally supported by LaGuardia Community College and New York City Council, and New York City's Council LGBT and Queer Caucus. We're part of the LGBT consortium at the CUNY, and so this is funded by that. But now I would like to tell you a little bit about our panelists, and then we're going to jump into the conversation, and I'll try to give you a little bit of information. So one of our panelists is Cici Suazo, who is a trans theater icon and ballroom legend. She was honored with the 2018 Advocate Magazine Award for her contributions in the ballroom community and performing arts. Her ballroom career began in 1988 as the youngest member of iconic House of LaBeija in the ballroom community. She became mother of the house briefly, earned legendary status in 2010. In 2013, she departed the house after 27 years to pursue acting full-time. She appeared in numerous off-Broadway productions, and I have to say I had to cut some out for the sake of time, but some are Lifeline's Queer Stories of Survival, which was turned into a documentary, and also two-time Helen Hayes nominees Dane Edidi's Figueroa's Play for Black Trans Girls at Woolly Mammoth Theater in DC. In 2019, she had the honor to play trans pioneer Lucy Hicks Anderson in an episode of Hi, Her Story. She was the first trans woman of color at Wow Cafe Theater, where she produced many works in her 12 years as a member of the collective. She is also one of the founders of TransLab, along with MJ Kaufman and Kit Yan. She had developed playwriting residency with TransLab in partnership with the Public Theater and WP Theater in New York City. Her first play, Shattered Reflections, directed by Orion S. Johnston, had its premiere in December 2018. She's the creator of Black Trans Stories, Matter Workshop, facilitated by TMI Project. And she's also a producer along with Rattlestick Theater on the New Conversation digital series titled For the Girls. She also serves as the host on the series. So yay, welcome, Cici. Our second panelist is Jayma Shelton, a social worker, researcher, organizer, and educator, and much more. Jayma is an associate professor at the Silberman School of Social Work, Hunter College, and the associate director of the Silberman Center for Sexuality and Gender. Their scholarship is informed by decades of collaboration with queer and trans young people navigating housing precarity, with focus on counter narratives and addressing systemic barriers rooted in cis heterosexism that limit equitable access to housing for all. We then have Pauline Park. So Pauline Park is a chair of the New York Association for Gender Rights Advocacy, statewide transgender advocacy group organization that she co-founded in 1998, and president of the board of directors of Queens Pride House, which she co-founded in 1997. She is on the board of WBAI, Free Speech Radio, on the Justice and Unity slate. She co-founded IPAN Queer Koreans of New York in 1997 and served as its coordinator from 1997 to 1999, as well as the Out People of Color Political Action Club, the first political club by and for LGBTQ people of color in New York City, which she co-founded in 2001. She also named and helped create the Transgender Health Initiative in New York, a community organizing project established by Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. She led the campaign for passage of the transgender rights laws enacted by New York City Council in 2002. In 2005, Park became the first openly transgender Grand Marshal of the New York City Pride March. In 2015, she was invited to keynote the Queer Korea Festival Seoul Pride Parade. 2009, she was designated a leading advocate for transgender rights in New York. 2012, Park participated in the first U.S. LGBTQ delegation to Palestine, a 7-day tour of the West Bank and Israel that included meetings with LGBT and non-LGBT Palestinians and Israelis. In 2012 as well, Park was one of the 54 individuals named to a list of the most influential LGBT Asian icons by Huffington Post. And she was also named to a list of 50 transgender icons for Transgender Day of Remembrance 2012. And September is disabled Afro-Indigenous non-binary and two-spirit storyteller with over a decade of global experience in uplifting the voices of intersectionally marginalized. Regardless of the medium, it is their mission in life to create positive impact, bringing access to the arts, design, and holistic wellness to underserved communities such as their own. They're founder of Holy Awakened Revival. And I believe that we got some, links in the chat for our panelists and about our panelists if you want to find more, because I felt like I had to speed through this, but there's so much information that you should know about all of our amazing panelists. So I'm going to invite us all, and I think I was imagining this as a conversation and not just sort of like me interviewing each individual person. So I'm going to start with the first question, and I will let people speak as they feel moved to speak. And also we will have a chance, if the audience members have questions, feel free to drop questions in chat. If you would like to ask the question yourself, like if you would like to speak your question, I would say probably the best way is to put in chat, and then we'll call on you to unmute and speak. So all of this is great. And my first question is, so all of you come from different fields, all of you come from different types of work. So what is visibility as a trans person? What does that mean to you in terms of the work that you do? And I will also try to spotlight all the speakers so we're all on a screen. Jema, no pressure for pulling you up on first.
No worries. I'm happy to say something in the beginning. Thank you for having me here. I'm so excited to hear from all of the co-panelists also. So, I mean, for me, I'm a social worker and a community organizer and a social work educator now. And I think for me, when I think about my work in housing and my work with young trans people over the decades, if I think about sort of like prevention and how to engage in a cultural shift in terms of my world of social work, I think education is the place to do that. So for me, being visible as a trans person and also as a person engaged in work with trans communities, as a person engaged in trying to shift social work education to be more focused on all people of all genders. I think visibility is super important. But I also, and it's like integral to my work, also to make sure that there are trans social work students and new trans social workers, because we need lots more of folks in the profession. But I'll also say, like, I have a university job and I'm a white person and I'm an older person and a trans masculine person. And I think all of those things to some degree provide some privilege and visibility, right, that I wouldn't be able to have in other situations or other contexts other than a university context in New York City. So I just want to also say that I recognize that's not always possible for folks.
Thank you. Does anybody else feel moved to speak?
Yeah, I can piggyback off of that. Jema, I'm sorry. Did I said it right the first time?
It's like the second time, no worries.
Jema. Okay. Thank you. So I would say for me, of course, visibility is essential. Visibility means life. It's the difference between life and death. And I appreciated Jema speaking about just the different degrees of marginalization and privilege that might come into the package. Yes, we are all struggling to some degree. It's not a comparison of who has it worse, but we are under the umbrella of transness, the spectrum, like going against societal grains in a lot of ways. And it's a lot. At the same time, there are other marginalizations that might feel more apparent, that might feel more in my face, and I can't necessarily pass or get rid of in the same way. For me, it feels ironic because I am non-binary, two-spirit. I am on that spectrum. I do feel intersex in a lot of ways, and still I have like this space of just like high toxic femininity unpacking of like that high Black femme that I was forced into as a kid, just trying to figure things out and being marginalized as the second class with sexism and racism and my queerness and being disabled and my disabilities being quote unquote invisible. Those visibilities, some of those being Black and queer and all those things, I wear that on my skin. I cannot hide it. I'm not going to pass. I might pass as cis, and that can be painful in its own way when I don't identify as that. But otherwise, there's some things that I can't help but wear on my skin. Other things are invisible. A lot of my disabilities are not apparent in some ways at first glance, and the ways that I have been erased, dismissed, fallen through the cracks, lack of accessibility, and all these different factors, especially when it came to wellness, physical wellness, mental wellness, all of this stuff. So I feel like in a lot of those ways, my transness is almost on the back burner. It's still on the stove with everything else, but it feels on the back burner sometimes because I'm just like, feel like fighting for disability rights and showing up as my marginalized self in those spaces, I feel like is almost speaking enough when it comes to the visibility of my transness and the vast spectrum that gender is, and how much of like that has nothing to do with biological sexual assignment, like, and gender expression. So I find in my work, my career, it started off in the arts and libraries and wellness, mobile massage, things like this. And it's evolved into my brand intersecting art, design, holistic wellness practices. And it's all about bringing knowledge, accessibility, sustainable, just like teachings, practices, these types of things to communities that are being underserved, that are being forced into ignorance, that are not having access to all of these things, especially when it comes to just holistic wellness, especially stateside from my experience, being more marginalized and not having access, like whatever social services are, feeling like in the country that I was born in, those services are not for me because we never see them, like we're the ones who are constantly being thrown through all these flaming hoops just to get fed, just to have mental health care and all of this stuff. It can be so frustrating and isolating. And then these things that we need to live and thrive and feel like whole people, the arts, wellness, preventative health care, I feel like a lot of those things are not accessible to people because we're just trying to eat. We're just trying to live. We're just trying to have shelter in these communities that are being like forced out of, like, just more marginalized, less accessible. So bringing those seemingly luxurious wellness practices like massage or something, it's a luxury tax in our country, massages, but in maybe more Eastern cultures, it's it's a daily preventative healthcare wellness thing. Everybody needs mobility and health in their bodies. So being able to bring this type of self-healing wellness, curiosity for knowledge, and voice to that, to my communities, I feel like brings a lot of visibility where we're just being underserved. And that's essential for me. That equals life, that equals sustainability and growth on any sort of level. So rant over. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. And you bring up some very important additional questions, but I do want to give a chance to Pauline and Cece to start us off with this.
Thank you, JC. Visibility for me means for my Black and Brown community that we have the power, right? And we also hold the power to be heard and to be seen. Because as we know that when it comes to these senseless murders, that we have the most highest numbers, right, than our counterparts. So that's what visibility means to me, that there is a better way and that there is hope on the other side.
Thanks, Yasmina, for organizing this wonderful panel. I'm honored and delighted to share it with you all. I think that if you think about the meaning of visibility, to be seen in its most literal interpretation, for me, it's important to be seen not only where one might expect to see a trans woman, even a trans woman of color, LGBTQ spaces such as this, which are very important, but also spaces where I might not be expected to make an appearance. So for example, last month I marched in the LGBT contingent in the Lunar New Year parade in Chinatown. I actually marched in the very first queer contingent in that parade way back in 2010, which was a historic event. Yesterday I marched in the Land Day March for Palestinian rights in Manhattan from Times Square down Fifth Avenue to Washington Square Park. And so I think it's, for me, important to approach this from a progressive, feminist, intersectional perspective and see how all these struggles connect as we pursue a progressive agenda of social justice and social change. So visibility, to me, is about employing existing structures, including existing structures of identity politics, to advance that agenda of progressive change and social justice.
Thank you. So I think I would like to jump to something that September sort of started talking about, which is this idea of multiple identities, of having multiple identities. And so I wanted to kind of loop back to that and ask if you have ever found, and you kind of started answering that already, but have you found a need to put transness on a back burner because of the other ways that you're marginalized, perhaps in your professional field? And you already mentioned in healthcare and other spaces.
I already started speaking on it once, so I want to let someone else talk first.
Yeah, is there, I guess, does anybody want to try to add to that?
I think I personally haven't, because I want them to know. I'm an educator here in the Los Angeles Charter School District, and I haven't. And there's reasons why. Because of we as adults, as educators, we have the opportunity to potentially sit and give the proper tools to the newer generation, right? Our future leaders. And so I want them to see that there is someone that looks like them in a classroom setting, right? Um, and so I think it goes into comfortability and confidence when you're able to see someone that looks just like you in a classroom setting. So I feel that no, I don't have to put that in the back burner, um, especially when you are proud and you hold your head high about who you are, right? And I think that's what I aim to show my students, that hold your head high, right? And be proud as how you present out here. And a lot of them are confident. Um, and they surprise me every day and they teach me every day as I teach them.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody else feel moved to continue with this question or has anything to add.
Well, I would just add a few things if I could use the C word, capitalism, and talk about structural issues. There's structural injustice in this country, which I hate to say it, but was founded on the enslavement of African Americans and the genocide of indigenous Native Americans. And while we have made progress in certain areas, late stage neoliberal capitalism imposes profound structural inequalities on LGBT queer people, as well as people of color, and obviously queer people of color, trans people of color in particular. So I think to engineer real change, we have to go beyond rhetoric that simply talks about enhancing representation from underrepresented groups, important as that is, and address larger, more profound issues of structural inequality that are deeply rooted in this system of political economy in which we find ourselves, and which the addition of more people of color, more trans people, more LGBT queer people of color alone will not solve.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that comment, which actually kind of led me to my next question that was that I was going to ask, which is we often talk about representation and how important representation is, but is that in itself enough? And what does it mean? What does representation mean if we want to create a world that's more just?
I think it has a lot of seeds of like what Pauline was saying about there needs to be systemic restructuring, dismantling, and then reforming. There needs to be equity and reparation. There needs to be acknowledgement. I think that's one of the biggest problems about this discussion of visibility and representation is that the lack thereof breeds excuse for apathy and inaction. Just because it's invisible doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We deal with the wind and know the power of it every single day. And we curate tools to learn how to work with the wind. And there are a lot of people here in life that are just as carried away and swept away in this life that are not being seen, but it's being felt. It's real. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So the lack of acknowledgement, the deliberate silencing and suppression is the like 1 = 1. Like every silence is a life that's being taken away, that's being cut off before its time, even before the body has left this realm. So when it comes to restructure and visibility and representation, it has to be about real humanity. There has to be acknowledgement before anything can be fixed. We have to acknowledge that there's a, shouldn't cuss, but there's a freaking problem that cannot be ignored, that cannot be swept under the rug and being like, yeah, we know. So let's just move forward. It's now, not then. Okay, but we wouldn't still be talking about it if it had actually been acknowledged, if it had actually been addressed. We're not talking about things that we already have solutions to. We're not wasting our breath ruminating about stuff that doesn't need fixing. So that's what representation is for me. It's acknowledgement. It's the actual action and impact that is sustainable to like humanity as a whole, but especially the most underserved communities.
I appreciate what you said, September, and I'm also thinking about Pauline, what you said earlier about how we, recognizing that all of our struggles and oppressions are connected. And so I actually have been kind of like going back and forth with this question in my mind a little bit. Like I do think visibility is super important for all the reasons that you just articulated, September. And what I've been noticing as I've been looking at the like legislative landscape around anti-trans stuff, is new to me, I don't know how new it is, but the new to me framing for some states around women's bills of rights that are in effect like to in the legal recognition of trans people, but framed under like protecting women and girls. And so it makes me think again about like the question. I don't have an answer, a strong, like I'm working this out in my head, right? But it's that question of like, yes, visibility is important, and it's important in so many levels, like the micro level of like, when is the first time you remember seeing a real life person that was like you in some way, like doing a thing that you wanted to do. Like for me, I was in my 30s, right? So like that kind of visibility, and then the macro level of visibility of like being able to be a part of conversations and shape conversations and treated like a group of people that are real and that matter, right? So I can wrap my brain around that. And I'm also kind of struggling with this, a hyper visibility in these moments like today, and I'm a big part of today and translate visibility, right? Like the hyper visibility of a moment like today, and then what happens? And like, how does that serve to bring us together or like move us forward, while also maybe, I don't know, serving to put us in a hyper visualized kind of dangerous position, ready for counterattack. So I'm just, those are the things that are kind of swimming in my mind today, like very presently. So I'll just put that out there.
Well, just to answer the question I already answered in a different way, I lived in England for 2 years under Margaret Thatcher. The election of the first woman prime minister of the United Kingdom did not transform the country in any good way. If there was any transformation, it was not in a good way. We have had the first president of African descent who promised a transformational presidency. I don't see that he actually created much transformation other than transforming himself into a multimillionaire. here in New York, we have the first woman governor. I hope I'm not getting too edgy here by saying that I don't see much transformation as a result of her election. We've had two mayors of African descent. One did some good things, the other does not seem to have considered in any serious way the impact that his policies on policing are having on people of color, let alone LGBTQ people. So I think that while enhanced representation can be useful and important in certain contexts, representation alone is not going to get us to where we want to get, which I would argue is transformational change, social justice. I wrote a little blog post, which I'm going to put in the chat, about this issue. And it was a reflection on Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign in 2016, but also Park Geun-hye, who was the first woman elected president of the Republic of Korea, who was also the most right-wing president since democratization over 30 years ago, and was a total disaster and really did nothing positive for the country. So I would argue, I call it the ideology of representationalism. It's not that we don't need enhanced representation, because I think we do. I have friends, for example, who are Asian American actors who find very, very, very few roles in theater or television or film for Asian American actors. So there are sectors where representation is a serious issue. I would just argue that enhanced representation alone will not produce transformational social, economic, and political change, and will not alone address structural inequalities that are deeply embedded in our society. So yes, we need greater representation of underrepresented groups, obviously trans people, LGBTQ people, people of color, women, people with disabilities, etc. But we need to go beyond that towards a vision of radical change of society as a whole.
I wanted to chime in there. I feel that there is a lack of representation in the community of color. And why is because we don't have these platforms and we're not giving the opportunities like our counterparts. And to piggyback, Pauline, when you had mentioned about the Asian American actors, that really touches because there is a lack of representation in the business for us, right? Our counterparts, they secure all the high paying gigs. More roles are written for them to be on screen or on stage. There are opportunities for their stories to be seen and heard, right? For instance, Transparent versus Pose, right? Transparent went on for more than 5 years, and Pose only lasted for 3 seasons, right? So look at the numbers. Who gets what more? And even though I am the co-founder of TransLab with MJ Kaufman and Kit Yang, but they get more opportunities than me in this business, right? And I get the bottom of the barrel. I have to grab what I'm able to grab. So I say, when is the time for us to really get these opportunities and these platforms?
And I might add
We're-
there, if I may, we need more opportunities, for example, in theater, television, film, for acting roles, starring roles. However, we also need not only the power of being a director, so for example, Ava DuVernay is an African American woman, but as a producer. the ultimate power in Hollywood is not the actor, it's the producers. And
Yeah.
so representation, as important as it is, really ultimately flows from this structure of power. And how many queer people of color, trans people of color are there who are calling the shots in Hollywood, on Broadway, in any area of American life?
Yeah.
You do have them, Pauline. They are there, but they're not a person of color. They're the opposite, right? So you have someone like Silas Howard who directs The Handmaid's Tale, and he gets $250,000 versus Janet Mock, who is the EP, writer, and director of Pose, and she's making $40,000 per episode versus $250,000 per episode. Where's the fairness? Their stories are heard. Our counterparts, they get episodes written for them. They get shows specifically written for them. They get musicals written for them. My question is, when is our stories going to be told? When are they going to be heard?
Mhm.
We matter as well. Those senseless murders, there's stories behind those.
Yeah.
But do people know about those murders? No. There was a girl that was just killed yesterday in my backyard. Right? Is her story on national TV? No, it's not. But if it was one of our counterparts, they get thousands of media coverage.
Mhm.
We don't even get not one police car.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean
Ooh.
the killing of a police officer last week and his funeral was front page news. In all the papers, the New York Daily News, New York Post, etc., the local TV stations. And of course, it's a personal tragedy for his family and shouldn't have happened. But one wonders why his death, his killing is front page news for 3 or 4 days running, when the murder of trans people of color gets minimal attention, except perhaps in the queer media, and even then, perhaps not as much as it should be, much less the murder of 33,000 innocent civilians in the worst genocide of the century to date.
This September, you were.
I was thinking about, well, now I have a couple of streams of thought coming together from what folks are saying, but I was just thinking about the tip about places of power when it comes to representation, and how representation is just one sliver of a much bigger pie equation that needs to be considered, because the way the country in general in the US was born and built on blood and bone. It was never built for anybody else except the cis white man to thrive. It was designed and built in for them to thrive and everybody else to have to bear the weight of them not doing anything in life other than existing, and everybody else having to carry their load, right? So when it comes to the police, we've never had a serve and protected day in our lives. Like, it's only been there to serve the cis white male. It's only been there for those with the highest of privilege, to sick them on the marginalized people like dogs. Police were born from slave catchers, from slave drivers. That's where our police came from in the United States. It was never something honorable for the people. It was all about trafficking, stealing people, and selling them back into slavery, which is now privatized prisons. It's never really gone away. It's just evolved and the system is grown around it. So when we're talking about places of power and it comes to representation, yes, there are a lot of cop-outs. There's an expression in my culture, especially in Black community, American community, that says not all skin folk are kinfolk. And that goes across not just race, it's about community and people who are actually here for the cause, who are actually here to save lives, and people who are here to perform, people who are here to be tokenized, people who are here to literally sell their souls sell their soul in exchange for many, many other lives that they are neglecting by not using their privilege and place of power to create any sort of change. And there are people with good hearts, with good motivations, good visions. They get in the system. There are so many people in the Black community who are cops. They're not going in thinking, oh, I'm ready to kill some of my community today. They're coming in with the honest, good heart thinking, I'm trying to make a change from within. And then they realize this was never, it's working exactly the way it was supposed to work. And one person coming in trying to do the right thing with their authority is going to get sold out, fired, indoctrinated. The people that come to the academies, they're conditioned to villainize and turn people, their fellow human, into monsters, you know? So there's so much abuse or lack of accountability in these spaces of power that feels like it makes representation irrelevant when it comes to inaction and impact at the end of the day, and sustainable, actual, like, restorative sustainability justice.
Thank you. I think this is also a good time to say if anybody in the audience has questions for our guests today, and we can continue this conversation, but I do want to make that space for our audience members who are here with us on this Sunday afternoon. I think for most of us, it's afternoon. So I have to say, I just realized I'm not sure if we're not all in New York, but I don't know if where everybody is. So some of you I know. So but yeah, I think it's this in New York, lovely Sunday afternoon. So thank you for our guests and our audience. And if you have any questions, please type your questions in chat. And for our audience on YouTube, you can also type in your questions in chat and they'll be transferred over here. So I actually, and this is sort of my last question is, and it's actually interesting because this just, I just saw this, I think yesterday, where the president has, I guess, proclaimed the Trans Day of Visibility, which it's been around for a while now, and is telling us that he has our back. But that kind of brings me to this question of how dangerous is the time we live in today compared to other times. There's often a sense, and we just heard, I'm so sorry, Cece, about the person who just passed, and this is a daily, daily occurrence where we hear these horrible stories, and they often don't get reported by the media. And so then something like this proclamation becomes the main media news, and then everybody's now debating about whatever, trans people stealing Easter. And for those of you out there who celebrate Easter, happy Easter. But it became like that becomes the narrative instead of for what I think should have been today, which is focus on trans lives and work and celebration. So I guess any comments or thoughts? I know this was not really a question, it was more like an open statement, but any thoughts on that?
Yasmina, could I offer 2 or 3 thoughts? One with regard to the pride flag. A lot of people don't know this, but the compromise bill that has been discussed in Congress to prevent a government shutdown has a provision that would ban the flying of pride flags at US embassies around the world. And so when Joe Biden says he has our backs, but he agrees to this compromise, it makes one wonder, even with this small symbolic gesture, and honestly, while flying the pride flag to me seems like a very small gesture, agreeing to a compromise that bans the flying of pride flags feels like a real betrayal. Second thing, and this goes to our previous discussion and something September was talking about, the original restrictions on voting in this country did not only limit voting to white men, presumably heteronormative men, it limited it voting to white men with property. And so classism was baked into the cake from the beginning. And so our electoral college, this bizarre, archaic 18th century anachronism, which at least 3 times now has made the loser the winner, including in 2016, including in 2000, stems from the profound distress that our founding fathers had, all of whom but one were slave owners, for the public will. And so we have to question very searchingly all of the aspects of our procedural democracy, which is certainly under threat, but it has never been a system under which all men, even just men, were created equal. And of course, everyone knows that Thomas Jefferson owned slaves and had a relationship which, under conditions of slavery, is essentially rape, with one of his enslaved women, Sally Hemings. And so I think that we have to very searchingly interrogate all of the aspects of our procedural democracy, as well as our economic system and social practices. And so the pride flag thing in the budget compromise bill is just, to me, one red flag, so to speak, among many when it comes to thinking about how we are represented, or I would say misrepresented, by people in power. I am represented, but I would say misrepresented by an Asian American woman in Congress who, other than decrying violence against Asians, which is obviously problematic, the violence, and decrying it is obviously good, has really nothing to say when it comes to all these issues of structural oppression, and in fact is unconditionally supporting apartheid Israel's genocide in Gaza. And so we have to think about how representation can advance an agenda of social change, but in some cases can actually impede it, especially when we're deluded into thinking that enhanced representation alone will get us there.
Yeah. When it comes to when I think of safety and stuff, there's been talk floating around where I've heard people, I feel like from a very willfully ignorant place, say, I was trying to listen to a comedian, and he started off his set saying, we live in the safest times ever in history, like of humankind. We live in the safest times because we live in the present and we're the most advanced technology and all this stuff we've ever been. And I immediately turned off his set. It was like, I used to be a fan of yours and now I don't, because you were already a white man and now you're saying this, and it only comes from a space of privilege to even fix your mouth to say such a thing, in my opinion, because it's not about better or worse. We are in the same state. We're in the same state in so many ways that seem just figurative now, that my grandmother was, that her grandmother was. We're still fighting for the same shit. It has a different bow on it. It's in a different box. It's maybe a little more covert, a little more insidious, but it's not gone. The problem has always been there. We're still fighting for the same rights, and now we're regressing what like my grandmother fought for and marched in Selma to Montgomery for. We're losing those rights. And like you were saying, baked into the cake from the beginning, the caste system is the problem. Race and class get mixed together because our country built it that way. But the caste system has always been the root of the racism pie, like the main ingredient of the pie, to even try to make race into a caste that needs to be subjected. And so somebody can be on top and other people have to be on the bottom as a result. So I think when it comes to danger, safety, scarcity, I would completely disagree with some statements or frame of mind to say that we're in the safest times. No, things are still very progressively precarious. Things are getting struck down that have been established for decades left and right. Like just reproductive rights and all of the laws state to state with trans bills, anti-trans bills that are being passed. Like there's so much regression. It's sick, just when you thought we were making progress, for people to try to say that, oh, we're the safest we've ever been, we're the most progressive we've ever been, when there's literal, like, even in the most basic timeline that a middle schooler can put together, you will see that we have regressed. No, we're not doing better. We're not the safest we've ever been. There's danger so much, and technology has advanced. Information is out there. There's less opportunity for suppression of stories, but then it's just evolved into another way, right? Now the algorithms are suppressing stories instead of the people in blue just burning tapes or whatever evidence. Like that's still happening, but as much as technology has progressed, it's just given people more of an access to, I feel like, knowledge to try to shine a light on injustice, because so much is under the rug. So yeah, bringing it out to talk about it is very important. And I feel like we've reduced all of that into one word, that is representation, but it's so much deeper than that.
I would just point out, Equality Federation says there are at least 269 bills, anti-LGBTQ bills, currently pending in state legislatures. Over 200 of those are transgender-specific bills that would restrict the rights of trans people. Oklahoma leads the country, and tragically, we saw the results of that with the death of Nex Benedict, who was a non-binary student who was physically assaulted by two other students in school. And so we have to consider the impact of negative legislation on our community, including our most vulnerable children and youth, who are under assault, in some cases physical assault, in schools, through cyberbullying, through harassment and discrimination of all kinds, including state-sanctioned discrimination in Oklahoma and many other states, even in a so-called blue state like New York. And I am really happy that we were able to get the Gender Expression on Discrimination Act finally enacted by the state legislature. There is still pervasive bullying and bias-based harassment in public schools in the city and the state, even with the Dignity for All Students Act, which I helped get passed, which was the first law enacted by the state legislature that included transgender specific language. So legislation is important. Right now, in most states, the community is in a defensive crouch, trying to ward off anti-LGBTQ legislation. But implementation is important, public education is important, and above all, we have to engineer broad social change, which includes a transformation of the way that people think about gender, gender identity and expression, and sexual orientation, sex, and gender, but in a way that is intersectional, so that we're not siloed into talking only about transgender as some isolated phenomenon, when in fact it is implicated in the sex-gender binary as a whole, which I believe is the source of not only the oppression of trans people, but of women and girls, men and boys, non-binary people, intersex people, really of all of us in different ways. Even the most privileged, white, cisgendered, heteronormative man faces gender oppression because of the sex-gender binary and the way it restricts his ability to express himself. And here we're talking about obviously the most privileged in the social hierarchy, all the more so with those who identify as women, obviously trans people, people of color, etc. And so we really have to engineer a process of transforming the way society thinks about gender, as well as race, ethnicity, class, but think about the connections and the relationships between and among these interlocking structures of oppression.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Pauline. I just have one really quick thing to say. I completely agree with you. And it brings me back to something that you said earlier, and now I can't remember what it was, but it was something that was way better articulated than I was trying to do. But the idea of the way that we talk about things and the labels we use to talk about them can serve to also like bring people along or put up, like make people think, oh, that has nothing to do with me. And so I've thought about that a little bit. Lately with some of the work that I'm doing around like how we talk about trans affirming care, right? As if that's but gender affirming care as a thing. And then but people think that doesn't apply to them if they're not trans, right? So thinking like actually, asking people like, have you ever had gender affirming care? And I did a training a couple weeks ago and people were like no one really raised their hand. And I was like, oh, well, when you've gone for care, does your care provider recognize, acknowledge, and respect your gender? And they're like, yeah. And I was like, all right, like, congratulations, you've received some gender affirming care there, right? And then I also was like, and here's some forms of care that actually are gender affirming care that like all people receive. So I'm just thinking a lot about like how it's important to, to bring it back to visibility, like to be visible and to like have our joys and our successes and our issues and our challenges matter. And also, they're not separate from those of humans, period. And I think that there's such a divide right now, obviously, but like, how are we thinking about how we talk about it and message around it so that people connect to it as like, oh, right, we're people, right? As opposed to like seeing a trans thing and either saying like, oh, that's got nothing to do with me, or oh, that's awful, I'm not gonna, that's a terrible thing, right? So if anyone has good ideas around that, I'm way open to hearing them.
Could I just say thanks so much, Gemma? But I have done hundreds of transgender sensitivity trainings over the years. And when people come into the training, they think I'm going to be talking about hormones, surgery, and medical interventions for a tiny percentage of the population. But I relate that to everyone by broadening the conversation so that they realize that transgender isn't just about medical interventions that they will never undergo for a tiny percentage of the population. It's really about all of us and these larger structures of oppression. And I think, if I may say this, within the trans community, there is a discourse, a medicalized discourse that in some important ways, even though it's well-meaning and it's motivated by an attempt to preserve and enhance our access to types of medical intervention, and that's very important. If we engage in a discourse that essentially specializes trans care as a set of medical interventions for a small number of people that most Americans will never contemplate, we in some ways do ourselves a disservice, because it's only by expanding that circle that we'll be able to engage people. So for example, why is it that the United States is the only developed country in the world without universal health care? If you expand the conversation beyond, oh, please give us a few crumbs from the table so that we can access hormones and surgery and some other types of medical interventions, to why is it that there are millions of people who are uninsured or underinsured, despite healthcare reforms that supposedly brought us to near universal healthcare coverage? Then we draw in people who initially might have not thought that transgender was their issue, and realize that it's actually about all of us. And so, for example, linking transgender as an issue to reproductive rights. When I've done trainings, almost no one thinks of the connection between the two. And yet there's a really important connection. And then there's a larger philosophical connection of bodily autonomy. And once you make those connections for people, then they see that it behooves them to become invested in a cause that may have seemed entirely distant to them, transgender rights, to use a label, right? Which I have used and continue to use. But then, for example, women in the audience see that the profound structural misogyny of our healthcare system is implicated in the transphobia of healthcare providers. People of color see that discrimination and lack of care relates to the transphobia of the healthcare system, particularly obviously for trans people of color, et cetera, people with disabilities. I've told a story and it's really grabbed people. It actually, I'll tell the story very briefly, it has on the surface nothing to do with trans people. I was at the Museum of Modern Art some years ago to see a film, and I went to the restroom. They have gendered restrooms, the men's room, the women's room. Went into the women's room. There was a line of 3 or 4 women, and the bathroom door opened, and a woman was pushing an elderly man in a wheelchair into the restroom and pushed him into the wheelchair accessible stall. One of the women in front of me was clucking about this and seemed shocked and appalled that there would be a man, an obviously cisgendered heteronormative man, in the women's room. But if she thought for a minute, she might have wondered, well, why is this woman, and I don't know if it was his wife, his sister, caretaker, friend, pushing him into a stall in the women's room, because there were no other good options. There was no gender neutral restroom. There's no single user restroom on that floor of the museum. And when I tell the story, people's eyes open up and they think, oh, okay, so lack of access or inappropriately, unnecessarily gendered spaces actually relates to me. Maybe because I am a parent with small children, maybe because I am a caretaker for someone with a mobility issue or disability issue. And so my strategy when I talk to people about transgender is to ensure that they understand that it's not just about medical interventions for a small number of people, as important as that access is, but that it's actually about structural inequalities and impediments to people across the spectrum from every demographic group in society. And once they see that, if they hear a story like that, then it opens up their minds and they suddenly think, oh, okay, this isn't just about hormones or surgery for trans people. This is a much bigger issue. Why, for example, was the ACA, why was there no provision in the ACA, Obamacare, to prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender, defined to include gender identity and expression? There was an opportunity that was missed by the people in power. And at that point, Democrats controlled both houses of Congress. So we can't blame the Republicans for that. And so my strategy when talking about transgender issues is to make sure that they understand that ultimately they need to be invested in transgender rights, because it's not just about a small population. It's really about all of us.
Thank you. You actually reminded me of a story where recently there was a father asking which bathroom he's supposed to take his young daughter, like which restroom is he supposed to go into with his child, and you know how some of these regulations affect everyone. So thank you for sharing that story. We do have a question in chat, and it says, greetings from Syracuse. There has been a discussion of hypervisibility and the current wave of anti-trans legislation and transphobic violence. I was wondering if any of the panelists feel comfortable in sharing their own experience with visibility, have shifted in recent years, and if they feel this is connected to their own intersectional identities. Again, only if people feel comfortable. And you can probably, I think you can see the question in chat as well. So I don't know if anybody wants to reflect on that. And I do want to say that it's 6:18. We should probably wrap it up in the next 10 minutes, just to be respectful of everybody's time and commitments. As much as I feel like we should just talk forever. So, but yeah, did anybody want to reflect on that question about the shift in invisibility and connection to intersectional identities?
I feel like, well, like what Pauline was saying about a lot of the things that are pending in office and stuff right now, there are a lot of major shifts happening. I feel like I've been feeling some immense shifts since 2016 in the state of the country, not just because of who was elected that year, but it absolutely was a proponent of it. But the fact that there was this dissimulation. It felt like it was one of the pinpointing factors and where we started more noticeably publicly regressing instead of maybe behind closed doors, bills not being passed or people being left out and stuff like that. And I feel like there was another bigger global shift when it came to COVID and 2020 hit and all of those things. And I felt a huge shift in a lot of ways that brought a lot more visibility to people, individuals, and communities that were not visible at all or had been shouting forever, but finally had more people looking, more people online to share their stories and connect with each other in ways that there weren't before. And it brought a lot of accessibility and visibility where there wasn't any. And at the same time, it's been really challenging. I feel like for me since COVID and figuring out my gender and identity on top of my late diagnosis disabilities. Some were chronic, some were chronically misdiagnosed, and I finally am on the right track. And I felt like when the world stood still for a bit, one of the silver linings I observed was that of reconnection in a really weird way. Like we were all disconnected face to face in a lot of ways, and somehow a weird silver lining about the pandemic turned into people connecting emotionally and humanly in ways that they didn't have access to before because capitalism is fast, it's efficient, it's not made for human consumption, and literally nobody had time. You were too busy trying to survive, and it was very easy to be like, it's the weekend, let's go drink and dance about it, never talk about it. So when we didn't have those options anymore and people couldn't ignore the things that capital, like the oppression of everything, it really shifted into more recognition and I feel like forced accountability in a lot of ways that people were not ready for. And it brought a lot of visibility to light, not just gender identity, but the increase of domestic violence, of mental health awareness, and all of those things that happened at the same time. Everything was coming up that had been bubbling just beneath the surface for so long. So I feel like all of humanity was begging for the pace to slow down, for some rest, for a break, but we were not asking for the cost of lives to do it. We just all wanted to take a beat and have a break, So the shift has been ongoing. The pandemic is not over. It's just a new era of existing. And there's been a lot of quote unquote pros and cons, but my journey has been an intersectional one, a having the capacity to have the gratitude in some of those silver linings. There was a lot around my disability that I didn't have access to before, and now I have connection to community and resources that I didn't. So when it came to my intersections and finding accessibility, especially for just life-saving resources of even just being seen and heard by fellow community, like me too, I've been gaslit my whole life and told that I was crazy, like me too, is it saves lives to be able to come together in a lot of ways. So I don't know if that even answers the question, but those are my thoughts on it.
Um, We had another question, and I am going to try to make this a little bit more general, which is basically there's a lot of backlash against LGBT curriculum in the primary and secondary education. And the question was specifically how CLAGS community would handle this. But I'm going to go to the second part of the question, which is this a battle that should be pushed, or should the LGBT movement adopt a more passive approach towards outreaching to children? And this is an interesting question because there's always this kind of like children scare, and I teach LGBTQ history to college students, and when we look at the history, there's so often this kind of like, but the children, and then that justifies oppressing adults and killing adults and imprisoning adults, right? But it's always like, oh, but the children. So, and it's also assuming that children are not LGBT. So I don't know if anybody had any thoughts on that. It's sort of like, I guess, backing up from, or sort of being like, no, we need to be included in the teaching in the curriculum.
Well, I would say we shouldn't back away from the fight, but we should connect it to other struggles. So, for example, Ron DeSantis, the odious governor of Florida, who has attacked LGBTQ people relentlessly in Florida with, for example, the so-called Don't Say Gay bill, among other pieces of really appalling legislation, has also essentially banned discussion of race, using the expression critical race theory, which, by the way, is not taught in any high school or college. It's an elective in a handful of law schools. But critical race theory has become this blanket term that the right uses for any discussion of racism or the history of race. We should connect the censorship and the silencing of LGBTQ people in curricula, not only K through 12, but also at the university level, in states like Florida, Texas, etc., with these broader issues, the attempt to essentially ban the teaching of African American history, and also what they call DEI, and any discussion of diversity, by making common cause with communities of color, with women's organizations, with civil liberties organizations, to address the fundamental problem of attempting to eliminate any discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity, as well as race, ethnicity, etc., from the curricula of public schools and public colleges and universities. And so, per my previous comments, it's all about making common cause, making connections, articulating relationships so that people can see that they, even if they're not LGBT queer themselves, should be invested in defending and even expanding discussion of LGBTQ issues in public schools and public colleges and universities.
Thank you.
I have thoughts about education and higher education and some of the inaccessibility, some of the privileges that come with it that folks have had. It makes me think of who was it? It was Rockefeller that said, "I don't need a nation of thinkers, I need a nation of workers." And the nation has been built off that rhetoric. The education system at large has been built off that rhetoric. I believe, especially public education, is not meant to teach you anything. It's meant to train you to be led by other people and to not ask questions and to know how to sit for 16 hours a day and listen to the bell, know how to take breaks, preparing you for the office life. And I think that children are the worst, some of the worst, most underserved and abused community of people on the planet. They're always being used as pawns. They're always being oppressed. Anytime we talk about children, and anybody who complains about protecting the future of children to enforce anti-progressive laws and systems in place, is really asking, well, how am I going to be able to have influence and control over the future if it's not set up the same way that I grew up in? How am I supposed to control the future and ensure my future if I'm not controlling the children? And for me, children constantly being used as pawns, their emotions not being considered, their humanity not being considered, their knowledge being stolen away from them to where they're being ignorant, they're forced to be ignorant, they're forced to be conditioned, they're forced to perpetuate the same nonsense when we're not stupid. And we're in the digital age, these toddlers are on their phones, they know what they're doing. They can educate themselves, and they are blessed for that because, I had to wait for commercials for things. This is just the age that I lived in. So they've never known that, and bless them for it. That is fantastic. But it is completely unfair the way that people are constantly trying to objectify and dollify, turn into pawns children for their own agenda of hate, because you're not serving the children anything. The children are always suffering and getting the short end of the stick, the shit end of the stick, are never allowed voices, never allowed knowledge. You're ruining our future, and that's what they want because they don't want the change. So anybody who's trying to use children as an excuse for things not being more educational, seeking of knowledge, more inclusive, more accepting, is absolutely a part of the problem and doesn't give a fuck about humanity or the future. That's what I think about those people. They don't care about anybody but themselves.
Thank you. Cece, do you want to share something with us? And I'm starting with you, and it can be this question or it can be anything else, because I'm going to start with wrapping us up to the conclusion. So if there's anything you would like to share, any thoughts, I'm not going to say last thoughts because hopefully this is not the last time we're all speaking together. But maybe for today, and then also if there is anything that you would like to share in terms of your own work, or if you want to tell us, plug us in certain directions, things that you think people should be aware of.
I think first and foremost that our counterparts use your platforms for the marginalized communities that don't get the same opportunities that you do, that don't get the same education that you do, that don't make the same work salaries that you do, right? Because we're all one. If you really think about it, we're all one. But unfortunately, because of the world politics, the climax and how things are going, that we're in two different categories, right? And those of color suffer more than those that's of non-color. So just use your platforms, use your voice.
Thank you. Jema or Pauline? Pauline, I see you're unmuted, so I'm gonna jump to you. Any wrapping comments or anything you want to leave us off with?
Well, I put this in the chat, but for those of you who don't have access to it, I'll just mention that I reference this blog post I wrote that I would encourage people to read. If you go to poingpark.com and just put Hillary Clinton in the search box, it'll come up, and it's this piece I wrote, Hillary Clinton and Park Geun-hye, a progressive feminist analysis of presidential politics in the US and Korea. And that's on poingpark.com, and it goes into an analysis of this whole question. And one other thing that I'll mention is that on my website, I also have 3 blog posts actually on transfeminism that people may find of interest if they go to poingpark.com and put transfeminism in the search box. So I just want to say it's been an honor and a pleasure to be on the panel with all of you. And I hope we can continue the conversation in all sorts of various venues.
Thank you. Jema, last
Sure.
comments for today?
Yeah, sure. Just again, thanks for having me here, and I really enjoyed hearing from all the panelists. Yeah, and I just encourage people to think about, like, today's Trans Day of Visibility, but what are you going to do tomorrow to make sure that voices are heard and impact is had going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And September.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate these discussions. It's important. I'm glad we were talking about bigger pictures and the larger umbrella of what visibility and representation even looks like after like actual reform. And if you want to find me online, you can find me on my website, Holy Awakened Revival. I have my blog page on there. I focus mainly on some of the invisible illness type of disability advocacy that I've struggled with in my community, especially when it comes to neurodivergence, autism, ADHD, things like that. So you'll see a lot of education and stuff, relatability things on there, and my services. I'm a designer, artist, wellness practitioner. Hit me up for the creative things. I'm available. And thanks again.
Thank you. And we dropped now, thank you everybody who's helping me drop the links in chat so that you can find everybody on chat and perhaps find out more about their work, have more conversations. I really appreciate you all joining me. I'm honored that I have known some of you for a really long time, some of you for a less long time, but I'm looking forward to having more of these conversations in the future. And thank you so much. Oh, I forgot to say, actually, I think I forgot in the beginning, but it doesn't matter. It says on the screen. I'm Yasmina. I teach at CCNY. I also work at CLAGS, and I'm originally from the Balkans, and I'm a queer. I'm professional queer. I don't remember. Somebody said that before. So thank you all. I'm going to stop streaming for YouTube right now before I stop other